Hey, you keep hearing of the term Convention of States, but do you know what it really means? Of course, there's an organization now working toward trying to get this out of control spending in our national debt, over $31 trillion right now. And, of course, there is a Convention of States organization in this country. I got the president of that, Mark Meckler, on the telephone with me right now. Mark is one of the biggest free speech patriots and fighters in this country. He was former CEO of the social media free speech app Parler. He was also co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots. He is now the president of Convention of States and Convention of States Action, which has over 5 million supporters and activists representing every state legislative district in the nation. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Good morning, Henry. Great to be with you.
And you're going to be your group's going to be in Wilmington tonight. You were in Greenville last night, and we'll give the details of that. I believe you're going to be at the Arts Center. Let's see. Looks like you're going to be at the Hannah Block Historic Community Arts Center on 2nd Street in Wilmington tonight at 6:30, talking about what the efforts are behind Convention of States. Let's start from the beginning. What is Convention of States? What does that actually mean?
So in the Constitution, in Article 5, there are two ways provided to amend the Constitution. All 27 amendments that we've done have come through the first way, which is Congress gets to propose the amendments and then puts them out to the states for ratification. The second way says that if Congress isn't doing what the people want, and surely it's not now, then when 2/3 of the states call for a convention, that's 34 states, the states can gather in convention and propose amendments, and that's what we're working on doing, and specifically amendments in our case to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, like you talked about, maybe a balanced budget amendment or tax and spending caps, impose term limits on federal officials, that's electeds, but it's also on the deep state, staffers and bureaucrats. And then importantly, to impose scope and jurisdiction restrictions on the federal government, meaning telling them what they're not allowed to do anymore. They were never intended to be involved in things like education or energy or healthcare. Those things should be handled by the states.
So, we heard, I think last year, a year before, I think we talked to the Speaker of the House here in North Carolina about this on the show one morning, Tim Moore, and he was in favor of this. It actually passed the state legislature on one chamber, passed the House. I don't think it passed the Senate here. So how realistic is it to call a convention of states, and how would it have to happen? Because you have to have the support of state legislatures, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it takes 34 state legislatures, and here we've passed it several times, originally through the Senate, and then didn't make it through the House, and then a couple of times through the House, and this year we passed it through the House, and we're working on the Senate right now. I do think it's realistic. We have 19 states on board already, so we're well more than halfway there. I think we're going to pass here in the next month or so through the Senate. That'll take us to number 20, and so that'll leave us with 14 states. I think it's very realistic to get it done.
Can Congress actually call for a convention of states?
Well, Congress has a role.
I don't think they ever would, but does the Constitution allow for that?
It doesn't allow them to do it without the states calling for it themselves. So it takes 34 states to make the application, and then Congress, that says in the Constitution, and then they shall call, and that means name the time and place of the convention. So once we hit that 34 threshold, Congress has a secretarial duty just to name the time and place.
So, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, this is certainly something that I support, and we've talked about this. We've had a local group out of Carteret County that's been pushing for a convention of states. Most people don't really know much about it, or, until you have these town hall meetings like you had here in Greenville last night, or you're going to have in Wilmington tomorrow night. But, let's say that it actually happened. Let's say that you actually were successful in getting 34 state legislatures to agree to call for a convention of states. What's the plan? I mean, it's almost like be careful what you ask for right now. Now you're in charge. Now you're in charge of $31 trillion in debt, kinda.
Yeah. So the plan is that the way the convention actually works is once it convenes, then they're going to discuss things that fall within those three subject matter areas I discussed. They're limited to that, because every state, when they make applications, specifies what they want to talk about. You have to have 34 states that say they want to talk about the same thing. So again, it would be imposing things like a balanced budget, term limits, and then power limitations on the federal government. They'll debate those things, and if 26 states can agree on any proposals, they would draft the proposed amendment language, and then that goes out and it has to be ratified by 38 states.
So, how safe would this be? I mean, I'm getting feedback right now from people who say the reason they're against it is because the liberals would overtake it and overturn the present Constitution. I mean, is that a possibility?
No, absolutely not. I think it's funny when we get that stuff because literally every radical leftist group, liberal group in America signed a press release 5 years ago. It was led by George Soros' Common Cause. It was signed by Planned Parenthood and La Raza and MoveOn.org, all the biggies and all the small ones, signed a press release saying this is the worst thing that could possibly happen in America. Former Senator Russ Feingold, a socialist senator from Wisconsin, just wrote a book about the entire thing saying he understood the process. He's just terrified of conservatives doing it because they're going to ruin the progressive agenda. So, no, there's no chance of it. The progressives know there's no chance of it. But unfortunately, they've co-opted some on the right, on what I would call the far right, to be against this.
So, when you got people like Schumer and we had Pelosi, thank goodness she's gone. But you've got, some very left-wing people in both chambers of Congress. And, if 34 states legislatures, if they did vote to do this, could Congress do anything to block it?
No, I mean, that's really the beauty and why we're doing this. The second clause of Article 5 was put in the Constitution specifically to wire around Congress and the president. It was actually inserted 2 days before the end of convention in 1787. Colonel George Mason from Virginia asked the question, are we so naive to believe that a Congress that becomes tyrannical or a federal government that becomes tyrannical will ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? They knew that Congress would never do that. They knew the federal government would never restrain itself, so they gave the states the power to do it without any kind of referral to or power by Congress.
So, again, let's say you're successful. What happens? I mean, you have an actual convention with delegates? I mean, where do the delegates come from? Who picks the delegates?
Yep, that's exactly right. There will be an actual physical convention. It'll be much bigger, but it'll look a lot like the 1787 convention. Each state, in this case, will send as many delegates as they like. They are actually called commissioners, and they'll send as many as they like, but each state gets one vote. So they'll gather. What I believe is that because Congress specifies the time and place, they'll call it for Washington, D.C. I've talked to every state leader around the country that's done this so far. They said they'll all gather in D.C. for one day, and then they'll move it somewhere in the center of the country. And because they don't want the influence of D.C., they'll gather. They'll look a lot like a legislature in how they operate. They'll break into committees and subcommittees and debate proposed amendments in those three subject matter areas. If they can agree on those in committees and subcommittees, they'll bring them back to the floor, what's called the committee of the whole, and then they'll vote on them. And then it takes 26 states, a simple majority of states, to send anything out to the states for ratification. And this is a really important point, Henry. People say they're afraid of convention. The only thing that a convention can do is make suggestions. And literally, they just then send those out to the states, and it takes a super majority to ratify anything. It takes 38 states to ratify anything. So 34 states to call for a convention, 38 states to ratify any amendments. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when you get people who say they're scared and they're worried about what might happen or we might lose the Constitution, you just got to do simple math. If it takes 38 states to ratify, that means it takes only 13 states. But how many red states are there and how many blue states are there? Currently, there are 29 states with both houses controlled by Republicans. 29. Yeah, that's correct. All right, so you got a very thin majority there. I mean, again, it seems like there'd be a concern that the left wingers would get a hold of this thing and take it over. Let's presume they did. Let's say that the left-wingers controlled the convention, and let's say, for example, this is the one I hear all the time. People are worried that they'll repeal the Second Amendment. Now, my mom retired as a cop. My son's a Marine. We're very strong on and fond of the Second Amendment. But let's say that happened. That goes out to the states for ratification. Currently, there are 25 states that have constitutional carry, no permit needed to carry your firearm. There are actually 24 states where you can carry your firearm in the state legislature. I've done it in most of the places it's legal. There are 14 states where you can take a long gun like your AR and sling it across your back and carry it in the legislature and sit in the gallery and watch the proceedings. Remember, it takes only 13 states to stop something. And by stopping, I mean they just don't consider it. So the idea that we couldn't find 13 states when you have 25 states that have constitutional carry, that's just ridiculous.
So how many states, again, you need 34 states to call for a convention of states.
Right.
How many, I think you said this earlier. Tell us again, how many states do you have that actually has ratified this through both chambers of the legislature?
Yeah, so far 19 states have made it through both houses of the legislature. As we talked about, we've made it halfway through here. This year we've made it through the House. It sailed through the House very easily. And now we're working on the Senate, so I'm hoping for North Carolina to be number 20.
So let's say you get the 34 states. I mean, what happens then? What if the federal people, what if the federal officials just ignore it?
Yeah, I get asked that because Congress is supposed to call the convention, but the reality is the states are sovereign entities. This is a convention of states, and they can gather anytime they want for any purpose they want. States gather, by the way, all the time for different purposes. Sometimes just a few states, sometimes all the states. So they have the full authority to gather whenever they want to gather and however they want to gather. So if Congress refused to call, I don't believe they would, because once you have 34 states, you've got a supermajority. Congress tends to go along with that, with supermajority pressure. But if they didn't, the states would gather anyway.
Let's get down to the weeds a little bit. You say that one of the number one things that this would create would be an opportunity to get a balanced budget amendment. So there's a lot of waste in federal government. There's no doubt about that. But again, if you're the king and you become in charge, you're going to have to deal with these entitlements too. What do you do with Social Security? What's the position?
Yeah, I think,
what's your position on that?
So I think this is a really important point. If you get a balanced budget amendment, it doesn't say exactly how you balance the budget. I mean, I think one of the keys is, and this is why we crafted our application the way we did, is you want to be able to cap spending and you want to be able to cap taxes, because otherwise they could balance the budget on our backs by just crushing us with taxes and fees and the like. And then so they're going to have to impose some kind of a balanced budget amendment. We don't know exactly what that would look like. And yeah, I think they're going to have to go after entitlements. I think one of the ways that it would likely happen, one of the best ways I've heard, and I'm certainly not an expert on entitlement reform, so I want that caveat in there, but one of the best ways I've heard is just increasing the retirement age, not for people who are receiving now or people who are going to receive in the immediate future, but in the long term. And this is one of the problems.
Aren't they doing that already?
No, they're not, unfortunately. And this is one of the problems that retirement age, people live much longer than they did when the actuaries did the books on our entitlement programs. And so folks are retiring early, living longer, and we need to push back the retirement age for folks in the future. And that has not been done, unfortunately.
I thought they had increased the age for people at a certain age, that they won't get it at 65, but at a higher age. Am I wrong about that?
It's certainly been discussed, but there's been a lot of pushback on that, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, so balanced budget amendment. What else? You mentioned term limits.
Yeah, 85% of the American public is in favor of term limits for Congress. They're never going to do that to themselves. And so it's been proposed in Congress over and over that they push out an amendment that says that, but they never do it for obvious reasons. And so I think we need that, but I think it's actually equally important that we get term limits for staffers and bureaucrats. I'm opposed to term limits for Congress only. I think it's dangerous. I think it increases the power of what we now know as the deep state. And so if you're going to force a rotation in office of Congress members, you've got to do the same for the staff and bureaucrats, or it just empowers them.
All right, give us details on the event tonight in Wilmington for our listeners down that way. What's the plan?
Yeah, so that's at the Wilmington Community Arts Center, which is at 120 South 2nd Street in Wilmington. We're going to be there from 6 to 8, and I'll be there with my co-founder of the organization, Mike Ferris, who is also the founder of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He was also the senior counsel and the president of Alliance Defending Freedom that was involved in the Dobbs case recently. We'll be there from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll give a presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the organization, a lot more about what you and I talked about today, and then we'll take a bunch of questions. That's usually the longest part. We do usually an hour Q&A.
Mark Meckler, the president of the Convention of States organization. Interesting conversation. Thank you for your time this morning. Good luck tonight.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.